What's up guys, I got a brand new video for you today, and today we're looking at the most hyped camera of 2018, and that's the Sony A7 III. Now I'm not one to fall for the hype, and this kind of happened way back when the A7R II came out in 2015. I jumped ship from Canon to Sony because I was stoked. Like, it had so many features that Canon didn't have, and I wasn't overly impressed with that camera, but it's a different story with this camera. All the issues that I had with the second generation of A7 cameras have completely been fixed. All the issues are solved, things have been improved, and this camera lives up to the hype. I also want to say thanks to B&H for sending this to me so that I could check it out and review it for you guys. Alright, so let's get into the specs. It's a 24 megapixel BSI, so backside illuminated full frame sensor. It has 693 phase detect autofocus points. That's right, 693. And it also has 425 contrast detection autofocus points as well. That's nuts. It does 10 frames per second continuous shooting. It shoots 4K video at 30 and 24 FPS, and it'll also do up to 120 frames per second in 1080p. It has S-Log2, S-Log3, HLG, 5-axis steady shot, which is just IBIS. It has an ISO range of 100 right up to 204,800. Obviously that's the extended range, you don't want to shoot that high. The EVF is 2.36 million dots, and it has a 3-inch tilty screen. You can tilt back like that and up, same as all the other Sony cameras, and it's just a little under 1 million dots. It has Wi-Fi, NFC, micro USB, as well as USB Type-C. They want to have both standards on there in case you're not ready to switch over. You can actually charge the camera from either of those, or even run the camera off power. And before you go out and drop all your money, if you're excited about those specs, this camera does not include a charger, and that's something you're gonna have to go out and buy extra. I did that because I don't really like charging the battery inside the camera. It's way too slow. So since I'm mostly a portrait photographer, let's take a look at some shots. All right, so let's talk about my initial thoughts on this camera. First of all, the build quality is really good. There hasn't been like massive drastic changes from the Mark II version, but the grip is obviously the biggest change. It has a much deeper, thicker grip now, and it fits your hand nice. It doesn't feel so much like a toy like the other version did. Now, part of the reason why this grip is bigger is because it actually houses a new battery, and this is probably one of the best underrated features of this camera is the battery. They've added a joystick to the back, which makes this camera a little bit more professional, so you can actually select your autofocus point versus having to go into the menu and changing things. Before it was kind of annoying, but now you can just change your autofocus point with the joystick. It also has a touch screen where you can actually move the focus point with your finger, and you can also do it while you're looking up to the EVF. Along with feeling more professional, they actually added dual cards in this camera. One is a UHS 2 card slot and one is a UHS 1 card slot, so you can do backup, spillover, and you can actually record proxies when you're shooting video. Now, it kind of sucks that they're not both UHS 2, but I have a feeling that's where Sony kind of saved a little bit of cost because this camera isn't that expensive for what it does. And the next thing that used to drive me nuts is the record button used to be on the side here, right where your palm was, and it was kind of recessed and you couldn't really hit it properly. They've moved it up top now, and it's in a nice spot, and it's actually a nice big button. It's kind of where Canon puts their button, and up near the viewfinder. And yeah, that's one really big change that's awesome for this camera. Other than that, it's basically kind of the same. It's got mostly the same ports. It's got a headphone jack, it's got a mic jack, it's got micro HDMI out. It's a clean HDMI out, so you can record to a recorder, but it will only do 4K up to 30 frames per second in 8-bit. Now, I've really enjoyed my time shooting with this camera. I've done several shoots and it really never missed a beat. The battery lasts pretty much all day doing photos. You'll get almost 2 hours to 2.5 hours shooting 4K video, which is pretty wild considering the old battery and the old cameras could only get like an hour max out of that. The focus is fast and quiet, and while we're on autofocus, we need to talk about the eye autofocus. It's really overhyped on this camera, but it kind of lives up to the hype because it's so good. As a portrait photographer, the goal is to always make sure that the eye is in focus. And so when you're using any other camera, some cameras you can't really move the focus points that much because there aren't that many to choose from. But usually what you'll do is you'll move the joystick and put the autofocus point right on the eye and then snap your shot or focus recompose. But with this, I've mapped the back AF on button to be the actual eye autofocus. So basically when you hold it down, it jumps out of the autofocus mode you're in right to eye autofocus, and it just locks onto the eye. And it's insane. I was doing some tests. I was just doing guerrilla style, hold my camera up to the back of the EVFs just to film it. And while I was shooting, hair was going in front of her face because of the wind, and it was actually still focusing on the eye through a little bit of strands of hair. And if you were using any other camera, it might be like a 50-50 chance that it actually stayed on the eye or if it focused on the hair in front of the eye. And the fact that this can actually detect the eye beyond the hair is pretty much a game changer. Also, when you're doing focus recompose, there's a chance that the model might slightly move or the person might move a little bit, and it'll actually take that eye out of focus just ever so slightly that it's almost a throwaway shot, especially if you're not using continuous autofocus. So leaving this in continuous autofocus, you can literally track someone like 30 feet away, focus on their eye, and it'll stay on their eye as they move forward and backward. It's pretty crazy. So this camera basically has the same autofocus system out of their flagship, the A9. And while I was in LA a couple weeks ago, I actually met up with Jason Vong and Danny, that one camera guy. And we did some tests side by side with Jason's A7 III and also with Danny's A9. And we decided to do some high-speed continuous tracking just to see how this camera holds up. As I said before, it does 10 frames per second. It's not like the A9 where it can do up to like 20 frames per second, but it held its own, and let's take a look at that. So Danny brought his 100 to 400 G Master, and we just set that up on the A7 III and ran towards the camera. The first test we used was continuous high, 10 frames per second, and the focus mode was wide. As you can see, it's keeping up with me pretty well. The buffer actually got up to 71 images before it stopped here. And it locked on me pretty good, but it had trouble near the end. Then we did lock on wide, and as you can see, it put a box around Jason. And did a really good job of keeping track with him on this one. He also ran quite a bit faster than me. And then for the heck of it, we decided to try the A9, even though the A9 is double the price, but it shoots 20 frames per second with no blackout. And as you can see here, it's locking on quite a bit better. And pretty much every shot was in focus, and you'd kind of hope that since the camera is double the price. All right, so now let's take a look at some high ISO tests. We'll look at some photography and video, because the sensor in this camera is getting dangerously close to what the A7S II can do, and that camera's like the low light monster. So let's take a look at that. I was really impressed. Now, I'm sure you've watched a million reviews on this camera. I'm probably one of the latest people to get this camera. It came out in Europe like way before North America got it. But this camera has amazing dynamic range. It's rated at 15 stops in lower ISOs, so shadow and highlight recovery. It's literally the best I've seen next to something like the Nikon D500, and I'm only comparing it to cameras that I've used, and that camera up until now was probably the best that I've used for dynamic range, and that's actually an APS-C camera. Now, going back to video, the video autofocus system in this camera is pretty similar to something like the A6300, so it's really accurate. I don't really have any comparison to any other Sony camera because that's the only other one I've used. It's definitely as good as Canon's dual pixel autofocus like I'm using right now. I wouldn't say maybe the face detection is nearly as good as Canon, but let's take a look at some face detection. Anyway, I think that's really all I want to share with this camera. I think I've shown you enough samples where you can kind of get an idea of what this thing's capable of. I really enjoyed using it. We shot with it in LA as just a behind the scenes camera, shooting video pretty much the entire time for an entire week. I was doing some client work and I was mostly just shooting with the Fuji X-H1, but we use this as a behind the scenes camera for video because 120 frames per second is so good. And I never had any overheating issues. We shot in the desert, it was like 90, 95 degrees. I never even saw the temperature warning come on, which is just so rare for a Sony camera. That always happens. I have a feeling that maybe if you stuck it in the sun non-stop 4K, it would probably overheat. So I've been shooting with it enough now that I can actually trust it and know that it's not going to fail on me. And so I brought it as the only camera to Nashville and I shot basically everything on it, video and photos. And you've probably seen some of the samples in this video. So yeah, this camera is actually really solid and trustworthy. I've had no issues with it whatsoever. But there's always things that I don't like and I need to tell you about them. First off, as I said, it doesn't come with a charger. That's kind of annoying. You have to spend another $100 to get a charger. I found that the screen and the EVF really aren't all that great. The screen is under 1 million dots, so it's really not that sharp. It's probably similar to like what the A7R2 has. I would even say the EVF is similar to that too. It's nowhere near as good as something like the X-H1, which is like up 3.69 million dots or something like that. And so this isn't that sharp, but I know that Sony had to cut their costs somewhere, and if sacrificing the EVF and screen for better dynamic range and all these other features they're giving you, I guess that's fine. I've also seen some people having issues with banding while using the electronic shutter in like certain fluorescent lights and stuff like that. I didn't test that out. I don't generally shoot with the electronic shutter, but you can research that on your own and see what's up with that. I know it's not nearly as good as something like the A9 where they've really made sure that that doesn't happen. And basically, if I want to get really nitpicky, there's only two more things. I find that the grip is really close to the lens mount, and if you have a wider lens on it, your hand feels a little cramped, but it's something I want to mention. Also, something that's really weird is that the SD cards face the opposite way. So when you're putting the SD card in the camera, the label doesn't face you, the back of the card does. I'm just getting really nitpicky at this point because there really isn't much that I don't like about this camera. All right, let's talk about the things I do like. I've already mentioned some of those. The grip, it's nice and thick, it fits your hand nicely. It might be better with a grip if your pinky's off the edge. Definitely feels more robust and less like a toy compared to last generation. The battery life is insane. Like I said, you could probably shoot for 2 to 2.5 hours of 4K video, and I don't even know how many photos I took, but the battery will pretty much last a whole day. The joystick for selecting your autofocus points, as well as having dual card slots for backups, definitely makes this camera a lot more professional. The 4K video is really nice. It's actually 6K downsampled to 4K, so you get a really nice sharp image. And the rolling shutter isn't really all that bad for a full frame camera compared to something like the A6300 that I've used in the past. The 120 FPS is definitely usable. It's a lot better than something like the A6300. I keep comparing it to that because that camera was last generation's features that this camera has improved on. I know this is a full frame and that's a crop sensor, but again, that's the only Sony camera that I've really owned for a long period of time to compare it to. I would say that the 120 FPS in this is pretty close to what the GH5 has, and the GH5 has really good 120 FPS. I like the fact that you can actually use this as a full frame camera as well as a Super 35 camera. I've actually programmed a button on the back here that actually jumps to Super 35 mode, so you actually effectively get like 2 lenses out of 1. But if you're shooting photos, you end up with a 10 megapixel file, and I was actually shooting some photos, and I had my APS-C 10 to 18 f4 on this camera because I was shooting some video with it, but I decided to take a photo with it because I thought the room looked really cool. And after, when I was editing it, I was like, man, this doesn't really look as detailed and sharp as I thought it would be, and then I realized it was only 10 megapixels. But if you're shooting video with it and you jump to Super 35, you don't really lose any quality. It just jumps right in and you still get your 4K. It's also awesome because you can use crop sensor lenses on this camera for video as well as full frame lenses. It has awesome dynamic range and improved color science. I noticed the color is a little bit more warmer, getting closer to what Canon looks like and less greeny, and that kind of green grayish tint that used to be in the shots. Obviously if you're editing the raw files, that's not a big deal, but the JPEG quality is a little bit better than it used to be. All right, so my final thoughts. I've wrote down here on my computer, price, because nothing in this price bracket can touch this camera. If we're looking at other full frame cameras like the Canon 6D Mark II or even the old Nikon D750, because depending on when you watch this video, there is nothing to replace the D750 right now. Canon and Nikon are talking about making full frame mirrorless cameras, but they haven't been released yet. So this camera is kind of in a league of its own. Like, nothing can really touch it. Those cameras don't do 4K video other than like the 5D Mark IV, but it does it in like a crop and motion JPEG. So this camera really is a jack of all trades, and it does everything really well. If you need a hybrid camera that's good at photos and video, There's nothing really in this price that you're gonna get that's full frame. And I'm talking aspects like S-Log or any type of log profile, really good autofocus in video, really good autofocus in photos, especially the IAF. IBIS, 15 stops of dynamic range. It handles high ISO with low noise really well. And Sony's really filled out their lens lineup. If you asked me 2 years ago or even a year ago, I would say, yeah, they still have a long way to go, but they've got the Trinity now. They've got tons of primes. Sigma announced that they're gonna make all of their Art series lenses in an E-mount. And even Tamron's starting to make lenses like the 28-75 f2.8. So the lens lineup's building up. Everyone's starting to realize that Sony's not screwing around. They're getting serious, and they're also done something tricky because they've set the price really low on this camera, but the G Master lenses are still insanely expensive. So they're kind of getting you into the system by making the camera cheap, and then you can go and start buying some of those expensive lenses. All in all, I'm actually gonna hate to send this back to B&H. You probably think I'm crazy for saying that, and I'm pretty sure that I'm probably gonna buy this camera in a month or so once I maybe sell some stuff, sell some gear so I can afford it. But I really enjoyed using it, and I've actually shot 2 or 3 other videos on this camera, so make sure to subscribe. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you know when those videos go live. And if you want to know where to get this, I'll put some links in the description. But if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike this video, give it a thumbs down twice. I'll see you in the next one.